by welcoming in tonight to this week's Citizens Climate University. It's a weekly webinar program of Citizens Climate Lobbies that provides CCL supporters like you and I with access to in-depth training opportunities on topics relating to climate change and effective climate advocacy. I'm your host, Brett Cease, and tonight's topic is going to be a review of COP26 and how it connects with CCL's work. And we'll also put a link in the chat where you can find some additional articles that you can read on your own about CCI welcoming COP26 commitments, the outcomes that we need to project from Glasgow, and photos from the CCI team on the ground at COP26. Our speakers tonight, we're going to start with the wonderful Joseph Robertson, Citizens Climate International's Executive Director. We're going to hear from Cathy Orlando, Citizens Climate International Program Director. We're going to hear from Isatis Cintron, CCI board member, as well as their Latin American Regional Coordinator, and the wonderful Solemi Hernandez, Citizens Climate Lobby Southeast Regional Coordinator, all of whom were on the ground for COP26. And as a quick review, at the end of the night, we will have the following five-fold agenda covered: a background and report from COP26, a report on the status of where things stand in Canada, a review of ACE and the People's Pavilion, and the chance to look ahead about the year after COP26. So with that, I will pass it to Joe, and thank you all for being here tonight. The floor is yours, and you're in for a real treat.
Thank you, Brett. It's great to be with all of you. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. We're going to cover these questions. So I hope at the end of today's webinar, you feel like you know something about each of these. And you know, the questions you give us later on should take us deeper into these questions too. So what is the COP26? What did we do at COP26? What were the outcomes? What actually happened? How will that affect our climate future? And how do we build on this foundation going forward? Now, for those of you who aren't familiar with how the UN climate negotiations work, they started from the 1992 Climate Convention, which was agreed in Rio de Janeiro. The mandate of that convention essentially boils down to a global commitment among 196 countries to prevent dangerous anthropogenic interference with the climate system. And of course, we all know that some of that danger is already here with us now. The COP is the conference of parties. The parties are the signatories to the treaty. So the parties are 196 countries, and also the European Union is the 197th. They meet as a body called the COP, and the COP makes legal decisions that have consequence in international law for how climate action takes place, for how other areas of human activity like trade and finance relate to climate action. The COP makes legal decisions by consensus. So it's not exactly unanimous, but if any country doesn't want it to go forward, it can't go forward. So what comes out each time at the end of the COP has been agreed by all of the countries. And that's worth keeping in mind when we think about what was achieved in Glasgow. It's also important to know that every COP is actually 5 COPs. So they not only have a 2-week-long, very detailed agenda for the COP itself, but they also have to operate as the COP, the 196 countries, deciding together by consensus new international law around the Kyoto Protocol, also around the Paris Agreement, and 2 subsidiary bodies for implementation and technical assistance. Normally it's 5, but this year they actually had to cover 11 agendas because of the delay, the year-long delay. Why was this such an important meeting, more than many of the annual COPs have been? Because though we're 6 years after Paris, this was the 5-year mark, the 5th COP after the COP21. And the nations that have made commitments to act on climate had to increase their ambition. And even with some of the increases we've had over the last year, it's not enough to limit global heating to 1.5 degrees centigrade. Science, as many of you know from the most recent IPCC report, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change in August, tells us that if we don't reduce global emissions by nearly half by 2030, that's just 9 years from now, we will have a very hard time avoiding persistent climate emergency. We'll have a hard time keeping food systems functioning, avoiding harvest collapse in multiple regions simultaneously, the kind of migration, human rights violations, vulnerability, and essentially breakdown of institutions that we would likely see is something that we've never experienced before. So this is the context in which the COP was happening. There were some calls to postpone it, but the urgency of dealing with these issues led the COP presidency, the UK government, to say we have to hold it. And they imposed a pretty strict regimen for COVID safety. So in fact, being inside the venue was pretty safe. You had to take a test every single day and show a negative test along with your UN accreditation. To get that UN accreditation, you also had to show proof of vaccination. You were among people who were vaccinated, masked, and testing constantly. If you got a positive test, you had to quarantine for 10 days. So again, this is something that nearly 30,000 people went through in order to make sure they could participate in this event. Just a little bit of a brief on our work. We had 15 badges per week, 30 total. That's our most ever. 23 total delegates using those badges. Some had 2 weeks. 33 team members total with other delegations. 6 of them were with party badges or countries. Some of them were participating in the negotiations. We had 310 contacts and leaders tracked in our database, 531 affiliated organizations, governments, institutions, 237 events, tracking all of the affiliations there. We had more than 50 bilateral meetings. We had 11 meetings at the minister or head of state level. The People's Pavilion covered 51 sessions. You'll hear more about that later. And, Isatis was able to deliver a very important voice, and you'll hear about that as well. There were major voluntary commitments in the first week. And all I'm going to say here is that each of these major commitments, including the $130 trillion that could be committed to net zero by mid-century, or the Regen 10 effort to bring regenerative agriculture to 500 million farmers, all of these are, one brick in the wall of our attempt to hold back climate emergency. And the wall can only hold if it is solid, if each of these is real. And so 2022 is going to be very much about making these major commitments real. The official outcomes of the COP, what the Glasgow Pact is what you would call the cover decision. That's the main legal decision that gives shape to all of the other legal decisions that come out of the COP, which are literally hundreds. It includes the first ever global commitment to phase down the use of coal. In fact, the first time a fossil fuel has been named as something that has to be dealt with in one of these agreements. It's the first global commitment to phase out fossil fuel subsidies. It recognizes the need for climate action to happen in line with the 1.5 degree goal. That's been years in the making. Even in Paris, it was uncertain at first whether that would be part of the Paris Agreement. Now we're ready to say that is the danger threshold. At Glasgow, that was really formalized more than before. Adaptation finance is partly a recognition that we are living with this danger and our action has to accelerate. I want to talk in a minute about non-market approaches and the very important breakthrough on Article 6 rules, but just something that people don't necessarily think about, but that is in the Glasgow Pact, is special drawing rights. There's a call in this document for international financial institutions to consider climate vulnerability in how they lend, in how they invest, in what kind of regulations they set, and even in the delivery of special drawing rights, which is a way for countries in need to get help keeping their budget solvent, essentially. That assistance amounted to $600 billion over the last year. So it is an incredibly large amount of money that the Glasgow Pact is saying could be used for that purpose. We got a new Glasgow work program for climate civics. You'll hear about that later. And on this question of loss and damage finance, there was disappointment that there wasn't a new funding facility created. There is something called the Santiago Network, which has now going to become active. There is a Glasgow dialogue, which it is important that this process includes not only countries, but also organizations and stakeholders, so that the rights of people and the needs of people outside of government interest can actually be part of how loss and damage finance eventually does move. But we need a lot more in terms of getting that finance moving. Now, on this Article 6.8, this is the paragraph 8 of Article 6 of the Paris Agreement. Article 6 is about how countries work together to reduce emissions. Cooperative implementation, they call it. And, you know, for many people, that equates to emissions trading. And there are some things about emissions trading in paragraph 2 and paragraph 4, but non-market approaches, meaning approaches to cooperative emissions reduction, that do not involve emissions trading, non-market approaches. We now have rules for how countries can work together on that. That means border adjustments can move forward at much greater speed. That means countries are being invited to figure out how they align policies of all kinds, financial regulations, the special drawing rights I mentioned, but even data systems and how they track and verify claims that they make or that others make, climate accounting. It makes it much more likely we'll see a floor price, which was a subject of conversation at this COP, and also signals the wisdom of climate income policies, which were actively discussed in high-level meetings alongside the official negotiating process. And I just want to highlight this last line here. One of the powerful potential outcomes of Article 6.8 moving forward is that existing institutions that are not necessarily climate related, think of the WTO, for instance, the World Trade Organization, can become mechanisms of enforcement for climate action. And that is a huge breakthrough that could help to make those bricks in the wall real and solid and help us get real climate action. And now I just want to hand over to Cathy to tell us about why the example of Canada was such an important subject of discussion among some high-level leaders at COP26.
Thank you, Joe. Yes, our lobbying focus is carbon pricing, but we do see the bigger picture. And our focus on carbon pricing in Canada was felt at COP26. For those of you who are not aware, Canada has a carbon fee and dividend-like policy. And on the other side of the planet, they call it climate income. So I'm going to keep using that term because I like it better. So we have a climate income-like policy here in Canada. It started in 2019 at $20 a ton, and it's been going up at $10 a ton for the past 4 years, and it will be $50 a ton next year. And the plans are to go up $15 a ton thereafter, up to $170 a ton by 2030. It's only in provinces that don't have equivalent carbon pricing, and that includes Ontario, Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and Alberta. And for a family of 3, you can see the rebates there. And 60% of families come out ahead, and additionally, rural families get a top-up of 10%. Between 2019 and 2021, we received our rebates via a line in our income tax form, and most people didn't know they were getting the rebates, and we're very excited that in 2022 we're going to receive 4 direct rebates. We're going to actually see the money coming into our bank accounts. Yes, Brett, I saw that. Okay, and so there's a consumer price on pollution, but then heavy industry has its own price, and it's called output-based pricing system, and it's like cap and trade but without a cap. There's a price for polluters. It's smaller. It does send a market signal, but it's smaller. And studies by both our Parliamentary Budgetary Office as well as other organizations have found that if Canada's carbon price was fully straight across the board, it would get us to our Paris agreements, and that would be great. So this is awesome. Okay, so next slide, please. So how do we do it? I'm not going to read all the data on the left here. I'm just going to say what we did was we did what we were told would work. We documented everything. We sent out action sheets every month starting in 2010, and we met every single month like clockwork. We pulled relentlessly on the 5 levers of political will. We submitted countless letters and documents as citizens across Canada to the Pan-Canadian Framework on Clean Growth and Climate Change. And I think that was one of the great things our government did, was to have all this citizen engagement. And in October 2018, we were 13th time lucky. It was our 13th time on Parliament Hill, and we found out we were going to get the carbon pricing policy that we have been lobbying for. Next slide, please. So these are the heroes. They did all the work. So just kudos to everybody who wrote countless letters to the editor and met with editorial boards and ran amazing programs. Thank you, all of you. Your work was felt at COP26. Next slide, please. So what have we learned since climate income became law? So we have learned in Canada that parties can get reelected with this policy. And that's a nice lesson for the whole world. These next two have to deal with pushback that governments get and how to deal with it. So politicians are kind of bullied, and there's a lot of resistance out there. So these next two things were really important. Canada was a founding member of the World Bank hosted Carbon Pricing Leadership Coalition. And in, I think, June of 2016, the largest number of companies joined Canada on the Carbon Pricing Leadership Coalition. So we had this huge number of companies join our country in this World Bank hosted place. As well, our governments consulted all sorts of stakeholders through the Pan-Canadian Framework on Clean Growth and Climate Change. I do not understand when people say, I was never consulted. I'm like, yes, you were. You were consulted. It was out there for 2 years. We have also learned that words matter. Pricing pollution and making polluters pay. Those are really good framing that our government did. Perhaps the one thing that made it really hard was the fact that the rebates came in our income tax. There was a lot of lies about, like, the fact that this was a tax and we weren't coming out ahead and stuff like that. So, but next year we hope that those rebates will, being so physically seen, will be able, that will get less pushback. And for those of you who deal with people saying, well, why don't we take that carbon tax money and use it for this or that? Well, then you can't get the price high enough. So how can we pay for all the other things that need to be done? 2 words: tax reform. Okay, and lastly, our Prime Minister was empowered, and at COP26, he said the following: just as globally we've agreed to a minimum corporate tax, we must work together to ensure that it's no longer free to pollute anywhere around the world. And that means establishing a shared minimum standard for pricing pollution. All right. Okay, next slide, please. And what have we learned as since climate income became law? Well, we've always known that the politicians need our help, and yep, I don't think they could have done it without us. And for countries that directly elect their representatives, this building political will at the local level is really key. I mean, it really empowers politicians to do more. Really important to document everything. Walking into an MP's office and saying, hey, we had 44 letters to the editor published last month, really empowers them. And you have to be more than an internet group. You must have conference and lobbying days. Then they start to really take you seriously. Celebrate every success, because it's a back and forth, but you are advancing. So celebrate every success and be prepared for pushback when the policy is announced. Celebrate for a couple of days. Maybe don't read the newspapers, but then know that you're going to get pushback. And the policy won't be perfect on the first iteration. It's going to have to be refined and protected for years to come. And lastly, I just wanted to say there needs to be funding for organizations to do this effective organizing behind the scenes. This was all done by volunteers. Kudos to everybody who did all that work. Last slide, please. And what could other leaders look to Canada? Well, first of all, it's in the Paris Agreement. This consulting of the people is written as in Article 12 of the Paris Agreement. It's totally in alignment with it. And also, every country is supposed to be working towards the SDGs by 2030, the Sustainable Development Goals. And the really cool thing about climate income, it positively impacts on every single SDG. You should do it as an exercise with your local group. How does climate income impact all of these? And so it'll help all governments as well align with their SDGs. I hope I kept that under 10 minutes. Thank you so much, everybody.
Brilliant, Cathy. Thank you. And I just want to highlight again for everybody, there is active conversation among leaders of how and why the kind of process Canada had, the kind of policy they put in place, the way that it can be flexible across the country, but there's a coordinated default policy, the fact that it can allow Canada to negotiate internationally, all of those things have leaders looking to Canada's government saying, how can we do something like that? And I just think it's really important for people who do what you do in CCL to know that and to be aware that that is the conversation out there in the world internationally. I want to hand over now to Isatis Cintron to welcome you, Isatis, to tell us about ACE, the US ACE Coalition, and some of your experiences at the COP26.
Hi, everyone. I'm super excited to be here with you guys. I am originally from Puerto Rico, so everything I do is kind of stemming from that need of how important climate action is, coming from like a small island. So I focus, so I'm the regional coordinator for Latin America, but I also focus on action for climate empowerment. And you might be asking, like, what is action for climate empowerment? So it is a section of the UNFCCC framework that, so that, like, just remembering like what Joe says, like the convention was formed in 1992. So this comes all the way from 1992, and it was affirmed again in the Paris Agreement in Article 12. So basically this section just names how important it is for climate action, education, training, public awareness, public participation, public access to information, and international cooperation. So think about it, like when we are talking about climate change, we want to have an informed and active society. And the work that we all do, right, that we are empowering people and how to have better relationship with their policymakers stems like in all these areas, right? We're training policymakers, we're educating community members, and we're also affecting public participation. And in that, like it comes like all the different things. So this action for climate empowerment is really important. However, it has been historically a little bit relegated and kind of put like to the end or deprioritized because sometimes countries see implementing the full range of action for climate empowerment a little bit troublesome. For example, asking all countries to implement clear and meaningful pathways for public participation, it's a little bit of a hassle. But what we have been trying to do is trying to reframe that and then trying to say, okay, but if you do public participation, what you are doing is actually making your work easier. You are gathering information from the community. What are their needs? Where do you need to be working in, and what should you be prioritizing? And a little bit of this comes, like an example that we give often is actually about carbon markets, right? And I'm thinking about France. So France did like an unilateral framework, like those, what Cathy is like, don't look at the news. Well, sometimes, they come because they have been put in place in the wrong way, right? And then what Paris needed to do after a lot of social instability, right, that we have the yellow vest, they have to implement assemblies to figure out a way forward on that policy because they couldn't have stability inside their own like city and their own country because they didn't do the right process. So it's not only ethical, it's also cheaper to do it. You know, like think about all the damages to public property and to private property, and then also just the amount that they have to spend to just tag down these people about the rage that they have. Whether like they could have done it, it's like, okay, we're trying to get polluters to pay. How can we do this in a way that is equitable? And then, you know, like, what are our best mechanisms? And then they could have gotten a better outcome. So Action for Climate Empowerment, it's set in a kind of work program. So back in 2012, they made a work program that was called the Doha Work Program. And this actually asked countries to create an ACE strategy so that they could weave in the elements of ACE inside public policy, right? So, so what does that mean? So countries need to figure it out. How do they develop programs of education, training, and public access to information? But then also, how can they bring in public participation and then cooperate with other countries to do that? There's not many countries that have a strategy, and no major or like major emitting country has one. So back in 2019, US or some actors of the US set out to create a framework for doing this in the US. And in that, we developed a US ACE framework. So this was done last year. So I was involved in designing designing the workshops and, you know, like the consultation process. And this is stemming from our toolkit that is called Engage for Climate. So stemming from Engage for Climate and thinking about, you know, like the Talanoa dialogues and then also the backcasting process, we created a process that worked for them, for the USA's coalition, what is now the USA's coalition, because back then it was a group of actors that were coming together to figure it out. How do we do this? And then I think like one of the main takeaways that I think is very unique in that time for the US, and I think it was coming from both our history or the US history, but also the historical moment when these dialogues happened. You know, it was summer and a lot of protests of Black Lives Matters were happening. So one like threading theme across this is that in order to have these like ACE or what ACE carries to is climate justice. So we are talking about a just transformation and equity, and what are the elements? And something that like I'm gonna share that I found it quite interesting. So I'm hosting right now a citizen assembly in Puerto Rico, and we don't have access to, like, we're not represented in the UNFCCC, neither we benefit from regional talks. However, when talking about community, about what they need in order to do ACE, or not in order to do ACE, like in order to do climate action, what they mentioned was ACE, right? Like they didn't mention Action for Climate Empowerment because they don't know the technical details, but they know, they say like, well, we need transparency and accountability and have like great ways to have public participation. We need to have education. We need to form our workforce, and we need to have access to information, because sometimes data that should be public are either behind paywalls or very hard to reach. So inadvertently, they say like, well, we need ACE. So with that in mind, then like the US ACE Coalition formed in I think last October, and right now we have kind of like 50 organizations that are there and growing. There's like 500 signatories to the US ACE framework. CCI is part of this USA's coalition. So we're super excited about this because this is the work that we've been doing. And it's like we have like some of our principles, that just really reinforce and also benefit from ACE. So coming to COP26, we had the opportunity to work with parties in setting the new Glasgow Work Program. So what is this? So the Doha Work Program finished, and that meant that in COP26 we needed it to deliver a new work program in order for us to coordinate what do we need and what does it mean to work in ACE, so that parties have some kind of guidance, because I cannot invent this. So when parties were here, we are saying like how big ACE is, and when parties are sometimes talking about what their ACE activity is, it's like, oh, we did like a beach cleanup. And we're like, that's kind of there, but like you can do better. So what were our key asks, right? Like I said, a full ACE community, right? Like I'm talking about the wide range of actors. So we're talking about that we want an integration of ACE across the convention, right? Like recognizing how important it is for climate action, then it needs to be touching different parts of the convention. We also wanted to have human rights consideration. And then there were 3 logistical asks that we're having constituted body or task force, kind of like a supporting body for the implementation of ACE. We also needed some way to providing financial support for parties, because that has been one of the main barriers, and then clear guidance on monitoring and reporting. So what do we got? So the Glasgow Work Program, because we like to name our work programs after the cities that we are in, spans from 2021 to 2031. And then it has a midterm review on 2026. However, it has some yearly reporting that the Secretariat has to do. And then we did got the transversal coordination of ACE across the convention. So yay. We have, for that, there's like an implementation dialogue to have different actors to work on the 4 priority areas of the Glasgow Work Program, which are policy coherence, coordinated action, tools and support, and evaluation and reporting. There's also a creation. So in the next session, which is like, there's always 2 sessions in a year. There's one in the summer, and then the COP. So the one in the summer is always called the SB. The next one is the SB 56. So in the SB 56, we should have an action plan. So we have a Glasgow Work Program that sets out kind of like principles and whatnot, and then we need actions, like what does this going to look like? So that's going to happen in the next summer. And then there's some instances of capacity building for both like the parties, and also, it's for the parties in collaboration with the civil society in terms of technical support for the implementation, and then also on how to engage children and youth. So clearly those are very good gains. And this work program is set in a very, we have a lot of principles for this. There's 9 principles. So countries are very insistent on reiterating that this is a country-driven process, but they also are interested that this is cost-effective, flexible, that has gender and intergenerational considerations, that there is a phased approach to integrating this into all climate change programs, and like both like nationally and internationally, and then that there is promotion of partnerships, networks, and synergies, that there is interdisciplinary, multi-sectoral, multi-stakeholder, and participation and participatory approach, a holistic systematic approach, and last but not least, all the principles of the SDG. So they're like, just throw everything in there and it's a principle. So clearly, there were some losses. human rights language was not included in the work program. And I think this is a reflection of how close and rushed the process was. Unfortunately, we have some great things that came out of COP26, but we can definitely say that it was one of the most restrictive COPs ever. In terms of participation of civil society, in which we often could not enter rooms or capacity. So COVID-19 was one of the issues, but also nothing like this has ever happened. So that is a concern, and one concern that is carried over to COP27. But talking with some officials of COP27, they're like, we want to prove everyone wrong, because everyone is like, oh, COP27 is going to have like a lot more issues. And they're like, we're going to prove them wrong. So we will see. But I think that our Glasgow work program provides a clear pathway that we can work on to push for more guidelines for countries, and then the prioritization of aid. So it does provide some great avenues for working. So we're super excited, and the long nights and working in between like parties and saying like, you should include this, you should include that. And like the parties calling and be like, hey, actually, like we have a problem here. Can you help us? Paid off. And I think we're super excited to see this work moving forward, given that we have had worked so long with our open COP, which is to work in expanding the civic space. And in that spirit, we created something that's called the People's Pavilion, in that we wanted to bring in people from civil society to have a sneak peek and really have like some more participation in this process, because we believe that having more participation can provide more transparency of the process. So to talk more about that, I'm going to pass it on to Solemi.
Thank you, Isatis. So attending one of these conferences is a privilege that most don't have, but nevertheless, they will benefit greatly from all the shared knowledge in this event. With that in mind, like Isatis said, we organized to make a platform available to people who cannot attend COP26, with the goal of making this process accessible to all. The People Pavilions, as we call it, seek to elevate action for climate empowerment efforts and open the civic space of the UNFCCC. This pilot program aims to provide a blueprint on how to make open public participation in the climate negotiations a norm. We provide a virtual space for people from all around to interact with and share their visions for a climate-smart future directly in the climate talk space, with a curated agenda on sessions related to action for climate empowerment. In our opening session, we listened from environmental champions such as Claire Newman, UNFCCC ACE and Gender Unity Lead, Felicia Davis, co-founder of the historical Black College and University's Green Fund, Tali Wonderfer, I'm pronouncing her last name wrong, but that's the best I can do, ACE Ambassador, Isatis, Cintron, which is Citizens Climate International Board Member, Latin American Regional Coordinator, and UACE Coalition Coordinating Team Member. And John Robertson, Citizens Climate International Director, and from our founders. Our People Pavilion platform was available for 2 weeks, shared 60 sessions related to action for climate empowerment, and had 100 participants. It's important not to be intimidated by the complexity and unpredictability of the COP process. We in our team are encouraged to embrace that complexity, study the process, and get comfortable with a dynamic schedule that change, shift, evolve according to forces that we cannot control. Despite the Glasgow negotiation does not yet guarantee a 1.5 world, and when it's hard to believe businesses, governments, and finance leaders, when they have not been trustworthy in making their pledges a reality, I feel hopeful and energized, because even though COVID safety measures play a role in severe access restriction experienced by many at this COP, including myself, and the lines to enter the venue sometimes were 1 to 2 hours long in the cold rain, that didn't stop anyone or diminish the commitment of civic society to have a voice and influence the process. And people are creating hope with inspiring work, with the inspired work they're doing all around the world. I am super grateful for the opportunity to meet the most amazing activists and elected officials that are taking meaningful action, and many of them are in this picture here. For the COP process to be successful, stakeholder voices, needs, and aspiration must be welcome to drive the ambition. We have to develop a strong civic engagement, build capacity, access to information, communication, coordination, and only by working together we can get this done. Action for Climate, I'm so passionate about Action for Climate Empowerment because it's the work we do, we at CCL do every day with every action. We educate, we train people, we encourage others to be publicly active and participate. Access, we make available access to information, and we raise public awareness. And this is what have formed climate leaders like some of you, like many of you actually, and me. There is not effective climate action without including our community. And it's not up to our leaders to tackle the climate crisis, but to us and civil society engagement, because we're the one we have been waiting for to create a path forward for a future with a livable and healthy planet. And that is, my friends, the power of grassroots community organizing, building the political will necessary for the implementation of effective policy to address this global crisis. And with that, I pass it back to you, Joe.
Thank you, Solemi. You know, I first of all, I love these pictures that you've shared and the way that you explain the process and what it is to try to embrace that complexity and navigate it. And for, you know, you've been such a great bridge between the CCL volunteer work in the US and the COP process. And I think that a lot of people would love to know more about, you know, what is your perspective about these connections? And maybe we talk more about that in the Q&A a little bit. But I want to say that, you know, Solemi, Isatis, Cathy, they're representative of an amazing team of people who jumped through all of these hoops and over all of these hurdles and went through a lot of rigorous planning. You know, some of the people you see in these photos, you know, some of them invested the last penny they had, or you know, found very unusual lodging options just so that they could be there to make a difference. And we made sure everybody was safe. We made sure everybody was responsible. But the teamwork was so important for making this effective, making our engagement effective. It's such a great example of how Citizens Climate does things. So the road to COP27, what comes next? We're going to be, in 2022, starting to train volunteers around the world in something we call science activation. That's basically a way of saying, not science translation, not explaining science, but actually helping policymakers understand how global climate insights relate to them more locally, whether it's at the city level or the national level. Because just like CCL volunteers are skilled at helping lawmakers understand the macroeconomics of climate change and carbon pricing, how dividends work and that kind of thing, and border adjustments, there are a lot of places where there isn't the existing local or institutional capability to downscale climate insights. So in order to help build political will for early and pervasive climate action, this is one of the things we're going to try to do to make those outcomes from COP26 a reality. I'm not going to read everything that's here, but this is a list of events next year where we are looking to engage and to help elevate the amount of ambition and momentum going towards COP27 potentially being, you know, a COP of the vulnerable, they're saying, of developing countries, where human rights should be more central than it has been in the past. We'll see. That's not always, as Isatis pointed out, a very easy ask. But human rights were in the preamble to the Glasgow Pact, as they're in the preamble to the Paris Agreement. And there is increasing awareness of the very thing Isatis was explaining, which is that without people actually engaged and helping guide you and involved in what you're deciding, you might not succeed as a nation. There's increasing awareness of that as we get to the point where climate emergency is taking over. Now, on the right side, you see some places where there's outside of the process engagement. I mentioned those institutions that can be enforcement mechanisms, the group of 7 countries, the group of 20. These big summits are opportunities. The G20 encompass more than 80% of the global economy. These are opportunities to change people's thinking about what is possible going forward. Our hope is that in 2022, we're going to see some serious forward motion. Our team will be engaging. And you can ask more about that in Q&A if you'd like. There will be more information coming out about it in 2022. I just want to share finally, before we go to Q&A, this tartan is something we created for the COP26. It is unique to Citizens Climate International. We created it to represent and to commemorate our engagement there, our team's engagement, and all of our network around the world, including all of you. And it's symbolic. The dark blue is the ocean. The lighter blues are watersheds and waterways. The lightest blue is the atmosphere. The greens are ecosystems, and the white is the cryosphere. And all of this is woven together. That is a way of symbolizing that our actions are woven into the fate of the systems that sustain us. So we decided to bring this as a kind of background message to the COP. And we're going to keep using it to remind ourselves that restoring nature is part of what we're trying to do. We're not just trying to get rid of carbon emissions. We want to actually make the world work for everybody and sustain nature in a way that can sustain all of us. Maybe we should even close by saying at that high level roundtable, you had metals company, a cement company, 2 prime ministers, the head of the IMF, the head of the World Trade Organization, the president of the European Commission, and a managing director of the World Bank, all sitting together and agreeing that this kind of international cooperation, where there's a carrot and a stick, is reasonable and important, and it's an opportunity for those who are willing to lead. And I can only say, as someone who's been to a few of these COPs, that is absolutely new to see that level of consensus about such a strong policy from such high-level leaders.
That is absolutely inspiring to hear. And I know that we have many other questions and avenues to explore, but we also want to be mindful of people's time tonight. So we have reached the top of the hour, and I am closing tonight with this reminder of where you can follow up on tonight's discussion. Joe, Cathy, Isatis, Solemi, and the whole CCI team have put out these resources. I can't recommend the newsletter is enough. And please know that if you have any questions about the recording, we've also put a link where you can find that on CCL Community as well as our YouTube channel. But on behalf of everyone that is here tonight, it's just my honor to say thank you so much for making time to prepare and share tonight's presentation. I'm going to unmute all lines and uplift the important work that our CCI team is doing across the board, not only in preparations for the COP negotiations, but each and every day to really build out this resilience, intelligence, and participation within our civic democratic rights throughout the rest of the year. So thank you all for being here tonight. It's so good to see you, and have a wonderful, safe rest of your week.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks, everybody.
Excellent presentation.
Thank
This was a
you.
real highlight. Just a real highlight.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Citizens Climate Lobby's training program. You can tune into more episodes anywhere podcasts are available. Inspired by what you heard today? Join Citizens Climate Lobby to advocate for bipartisan climate solutions. Go to community.citizensclimate.org to find more trainings, resources, your local chapter, national action teams, discussion forums, and more. Be sure to like our Facebook page and follow us on Twitter and Instagram @CitizensClimate. We also invite all of our listeners to subscribe to our YouTube channel for more inspiration. And together, we are creating the political will for a livable world.